And New York Times correspondent Jodi Kantor is here with me to discuss a Saturday, day one of an administration, certainly, that we've never really seen before. I suppose to ask what stood out from the march is almost to try to rein in this global impact that this protest seemed to have. But what did stand out to you about Saturday?
Well, let's talk about the big and the small. Let's talk about the enormous global scale of these protests. The fact the organizers did a really smart thing. They enabled basically anyone to go online and to organize one and to join the wider network. So women started them really all over the world. So in the big cities, we saw these sweeping crowds, just overwhelming downtowns, crowds in Washington much bigger than the ones who were there for Donald Trump's inauguration a day earlier. I also want to mention, however, what happened in some of the small and medium-sized towns in this country, not the so-called coastal elite enclaves, but places like Lansing, Michigan, and Cheyenne, Wyoming, and Sioux Falls. There were these marches that actually also exceeded expectations at a different scale. I talked to a librarian named Michelle Barton in northern Minnesota, and she was actually prepared to march all alone there. She decided that this cause was so important to her that she was just going to go with her own placard down the street and march. At the last minute, 60-something people joined her. So, you know, in a way, her own tiny march exceeded expectations just the way the ones in the big cities did.
So what does it mean now? Which is to ask, I suppose, the Women's March for Women's Issues, there was a decided anti-Trump, though, sentiment from those interviewed. Is there a conflating here that might interrupt the messaging?
Well, there's this tension, right? Was this a women's march? It absolutely was. Was it an anti-Trump march? It really, really was. Initially, the organizers resisted that message a little bit. But one way to evaluate what really happened here was to look at all those fascinating signs, right? Even in the age of Twitter, the signs this weekend really stood out. They were homemade. They were people's personal messages. People sat on their living room floors and sketched out what they really cared about. And even though there were a lot of different issues represented, the sort of unifying theme was anti-Trump. When I talked to women yesterday about what they really felt, what they really wanted going forward, some of them talked about individual issues, but the overwhelming message was, we want a different president. And the day after an inauguration, that's an extraordinary message to hear.
Interesting. So the current president tweeted twice about this. The first, watched protests yesterday, but was under the impression that we just had an election. Why didn't these people vote? Celebs hurt cause badly. About an hour later, hour and a half later, peaceful protests are a hallmark of our democracy, even if I don't always agree. I recognize the rights of people to express their views. Is it your sense that those two tweets were written by the same person?
I don't know exactly, because we never know, exactly what's going on when his fingers touch the keyboard and who else influences him. But there was a fascinating moment in Washington on Saturday when the presidential motorcade actually got very close to some protesters. So presumably President Trump looked out the window and saw what was happening. And so I think the question, which we can't answer here, is, how did he perceive these women? Did he see them as the enemy? Did he see them as people he wants to win over? He's gone into office as a very unpopular president. And so there's been a question really ever since before inauguration about, does he want to do anything to win over the people who really don't believe in his presidency?
It is hard. It would be impossible to ignore that as this was playing out, and the idea that the size of the crowds themselves were so much more than perhaps organizers even expected, that there was an incident between the White House press corps and certainly the new press secretary and Donald Trump himself, an argument, a disagreement over the crowd size at the inauguration. The administration made some verifiably untrue claims. What impact do you think this had on the messaging from the White House, just as it regarded the inauguration?
So there's a theory. We don't really know. But the theory is that when Trump and his aides saw the size of the Women's March, saw the way people were flooding in on Saturday, they may have tried to stress the size of the crowd for Trump's inauguration. Crowd estimates are really hard to nail. Nobody is capable of sitting there and counting every single one precisely, but I think it raises the larger issue of to what extent does the president acknowledge these crowds, acknowledge these women's message, and also I think it's frankly a challenge for him because a lot of these women aren't saying, oh, please do this on this specific policy, or I really wish you would do that. They're saying, we don't want you as our president. We don't consider you a fully legitimate leader.
And yet 53% of white women did vote for Donald Trump. Is there a concern, is it your sense, perhaps that a march, a show of force such as this will have its message blunted by, if nothing else, the facts of the election that was just had?
Well, I think the march is in part an answer to the 53% of white women who did vote for Donald Trump, right? I mean, many women who marched this weekend saw that number and they were horrified, and they said they wanted to reassert themselves. They wanted to make their voices heard.
Quickly, where do you think we go from here? Where do they think they go from here?
That's not a quickly question, right? Because that's the really tough, complicated task of organizing this forward. My colleagues who wrote about this in today's paper, Susan Chira and Jonathan Martin, made a great point, which is that very often effective rallies and marches are about a single issue, like the Vietnam War. This was about so many different issues. So I think we'll have to see if the Democratic Party has a way of channeling this energy and whether the groups that assembled this weekend cohere into something larger.
Should certainly be yet something more fascinating for all of us to cover, if nothing else. Jodi Kantor, as always, we do appreciate it.
Thank you.